Hey everyone, Gavin Seim here today to talk about some of the big new announcements from Fuji today at their X Summit event. This is, I guess, sort of an informal press release event, in particular about the XPro 3, which a lot of us have been waiting on. This was like an announcement, and then they're gonna have the real press event where people are getting hands-on coming in a month or so for this camera. But they talked a lot about the features, what they're working on. We don't have all the details. And so some of these things may change. And hopefully some of our grievances that a lot of people are having about this new announcement will change too, and Fuji will listen to the user base. But what's new in the XPro 3 and what's not new in the XPro 3, or at least what wasn't talked about? What was not talked about is IBIS. And a lot of us have wanted IBIS in the Fuji cameras. Some of the more purists say, oh, well, we don't need IBIS. Fuji doesn't need IBIS, cluttering it up. I don't really understand the purist mindset of, I don't want features. If you want super minimal, then go to a film camera. But these are cameras that shoot video, they shoot stills. I've seen people in discussions today about this camera scoffing at the idea of taking video with the XPro, but the XPro is essentially the mirrorless body style of the X-T3, which is one of the top video mirrorless cameras in the industry. In fact, I'm shooting this video on an X-T3 right now. And so the XPro 2 shoots beautiful 4K video. It takes beautiful stills. And it's interesting how people look at it, and I'm sure we'll have some different opinions. I've had a lot of cameras over the years, and I love cameras. I have a Linhof 4x5, I have a Hasselblad. I started out with Canon film cameras and moved to Canon digital cameras, and then to Sony full frame. And then I got into trying out Sony's crop sensor in the 6500 series, which is a great camera in terms of what it can do for the cost, but it wasn't inspiring to me. So about a year ago, I got my first Fuji, the XE3, which I still use all the time. It's so compact, it's so elegant. It has some deficiencies, but it's a very versatile camera. Then the X-T3 came out. So now for my crop sensor, I use Fuji, and honestly, I shoot on it more than anything else, and use it for most of my portraits even. And then for full frame, I have multiple Sony full frame cameras. I like the lenses, I like the compactness, but most of all, I like the experience shooting Fuji. And I don't really mean that in some abstract or whimsical sense. Yes, Fuji kind of has throwbacks to these vintage classic rangefinders and film cameras, and when I have this around my neck, it almost feels like a fashion accessory, and that's fine, but at the end of the day, a camera is a tool, and if it's fashionable and if it's pretty, that's great. But the real reason I love Fuji is because it's just good to shoot with. It's easy to shoot with. The dials and the controls and the interaction, I feel inspired shooting these cameras. In my view, for Fuji to be competitive with Sony with their 6500 line that does have IBIS, they need to get IBIS in their cameras, and there's no technical reason why they can't. I lose shots very frequently with portraits and things like that. If I'm using one of my bigger lenses, or if I'm using the 90mm, particularly the primes on the Fuji, because they don't have any built-in image stabilization, and Fuji makes these wonderful primes. The f2 primes I really like. And my 90mm f2, for example, I use for portraits all the time. But I have to really watch my shutter speed. I have to really maintain about a 500th of a second, practically, if I want to consistently get sharp results, because there's no IBIS. And so the same goes for street photography, right? Some people will scoff at the idea of IBIS, but if you're on the street and it's dark out and you're trying to capture humanity, having 2 extra stops of ability in that camera, 2 extra stops of light to be able to capture without getting a blurry image, that's a big deal. So in every sense, in every target of the Fuji, I think IBIS would be an addition. No mention of IBIS today, however. Another big complaint about the XPro is the battery. And while we don't know for sure, I didn't see any mention in the video in the conference about the battery. The battery in the Fuji is terribly small and has a terrible battery life, and it can be frustrating at times. We can assume that the sensor in the XPro 3 will be the sensor from the X T3, which is a great sensor, and that's good. It's logical that that will be the sensor. It wasn't really discussed as far as I know, but I could have missed it. The viewfinder has been upgraded. So this is good. The viewfinder in the XPro line is already more than in the other cameras. It has the hybrid viewfinder that switches between optical and digital viewfinder. And this has been improved. They've widened it out. They've put better color gamut in the digital side. And they're claiming that this is basically like a big leap in their viewfinder, their new hybrid optical viewfinder. They're saying is going to be really good. And that's exciting. However, Fuji has gone a completely different direction with the screen. And I have to say I'm blown away. I cannot fathom what they were thinking with this screen. And so as we see, and I'm going to be putting up photos from the press event of the camera, which by the way comes in 3 colors. It has a titanium body. I'm going to come back to that screen discussion in just a moment. The titanium body is supposed to be really strong, and it's supposed to be lighter. So I have no problem with magnesium alloy, and titanium is a difficult and expensive material to work with. So how this will affect the price, who knows? And they didn't give full specs today. So what we're talking about today is not rumors, but it's not a complete list of specs. It's not the official announcement of everything. They showed it. They talked about some of the new things that are in it. Back to the screen, because this is a big deal. On the one hand, I was hoping for IBIS and maybe an articulating screen that is absent in the XPro 2, but that exists in the X-T3, although not fully articulating, just a little articulating. But no, instead of that, what we have is this protrusion stuck on the back. And so again, we're back to the purists saying, no, this is good. People shouldn't be chimping their screen anyhow and looking at the back all the time, which is another thought that makes very little sense to me. Every photographer should shoot however works best for them. And while I do really like having a viewfinder and I like looking through that viewfinder, and I think it's good to be confident enough to not be constantly going back and forth and having to review all your images, the reality is we have digital cameras and screens so that we can use those screens and review images. But it's not just about chimping. The screen is the interface to virtually everything in the camera. Who wants to work with menus through an electronic viewfinder? The screen should be improving. The touch screen should be more intuitive, more like our phones, so we can quickly control menus and settings. And instead, Fuji is putting the screen away. So the screen on the XPro 3, as of now, as of what they're showing, when it's in normal mode, when the screen is put away, you actually have no screen on the back except for this little kind of square screen, which honestly feels like a gimmick. But to use the camera, to access the menus, let's say the quick menu that we use all the time, the settings, you want to go in and change things, you want to visibly change settings, maybe you want to review images. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to be embarrassed about the fact that if I'm shooting, sometimes I want to look down and I want to see what those images are looking like on the screen, even if that's not a complete representation. I'll oftentimes look at images on the screen to review the histogram so I can make sure I understand what I'm doing with my light. And so the screen is a critical function to most digital work. The XPro 3 is a flagship camera for Fuji, and it seems like what they're doing is gimmicks and saying, you need to shoot the way we want you to shoot. So this little screen on the back, I would be okay with it, other than the fact that it looks kind of in the way, it protrudes from the back. The back would be so much more cleaner if you could fold the LCD facing in and just have the leatherette on the back nice and clean. That would feel like film, right? Because you could hide the screen away. Instead, they've put this little alternative screen on the back that shows what film simulation you're working with or other settings. But in reality, if I'm doing a serious shoot, I'm shooting raw. I enjoy the film simulations much more than I do in Sony or Canon or something like that. They have much more life and character, and I think it's great. So I like the film simulations in Fuji. And this is coming from someone who makes film simulation presets for Lightroom for Capture One in my Filmist collection. So these are things we can do in RAW and that we do in RAW. And I still enjoy the film simulations, but do I really need a little screen on the back that's reminiscent of the sticker on the back of a camera that you would put in the old days to tell you what film you had in the camera? To me, that feels gimmicky. But again, I could deal with that. What got me was when I realized, and at first I thought, okay, there's a little screen, or you can flip it around and you can use the real screen. But you can't. You don't get to use the real screen unless you flip it down. So that means to access menus, to review images, you can't look at the back of the camera. You have to fold the screen down as they show us here, folded down. The screen is on backwards. Instead of an out-facing screen that you can turn and hide away, or instead of an out-facing screen that you can flip down and have a front-facing screen, the screen folds simply at a 90-degree angle or all the way down. Most cameras now that are on the higher end side have an articulating screen. You can easily hold the Sony at hip level. You can hold the X-T3 at hip level and articulate those screens. While it sounds good, I don't do it that often, but maybe you do. And I'm not here to say the best way for you to use a camera, but I think that's the point here. Fuji is telling us we don't get to use the LCD screen when we're in normal mode. If we want to look at the menus, look at the photos, and interact with the camera, we actually have to stop shooting, stop what we're doing, and open the screen, and it simply makes no sense. It's simply bad design. I have to flip it down. Let's say I want to mess with menus or review images. Chimping? Oh no. But let's say I want to do those things. I now have to have the screen like this or like this hanging below the camera. For some people, for some of your shooting styles, this might be fine. There might be people who don't use their screen much, and that's fine. It's okay if you don't use a feature. But the feature being there for the multitude of us who do takes nothing away from your experience. The idea that we become more pure in our photography by taking away functionality that is not only useful, but the standard of how cameras work for no reason other than we took it away makes no sense. Let's not pretend that this is about minimalism. There's nothing minimal about making it so we have to open this hinge screen to change our menus. There's nothing minimal about this little screen on the back that protrudes from the back instead of a clean, minimal design. There's nothing pure or minimal about what Fuji has done here to this design. Removing functionality isn't daring. Just like removing the headphone jack from our phones was not a benefit. It wasn't daring. It was just taking away features. And I hate to see that kind of mindset come to a camera company like Fuji, because I really enjoy their cameras. I enjoy their lenses. They could have had an articulating flip screen that also flipped out forward, which would have been useful for video makers. There's so many ways they could have done this that would have been a positive, and instead they made it a negative. Me, for one, most likely, and I think a lot of other people, based on the comments I'm seeing, simply will not be getting an Xpro 3. I may actually go buy an Xpro 2 because I like the idea of a sturdier, weather-sealed body, but there's no way that I can see myself having a screen that is this dysfunctional. Other than this screen, other than the fact that there's no sign so far of a larger battery, but who knows, right? There's no sign so far of IBIS. And so there's all these improvements that could be brought along, but if this had a solid screen, particularly if it flipped and articulated, could be a very powerful camera, and I think they would sell a lot of them. We'll see what happens. Let me know what you think. If you hated this, dislike it. If you liked it, like it. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and just share your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a reasonable, opinionated, but respectful Discord about this. And I think the main thing is we shouldn't all have to shoot the same. If you like shooting this way, or if you like shooting this way or this way, it doesn't make you a lesser of a photographer. If you like reviewing your images every now and then, or maybe you like to review in the Viewfinder, that's fine. Review the way that works the best for you. The key with quality tools, with really good tools, is that they work for us. We don't work for them. And I think that's the takeaway that Fuji should be thinking about from this, as we kind of have this divided set of opinions on how we all feel about this camera, is that something that's really brilliantly engineered and designed doesn't take the attitude of, well, if you don't like it, buy something else. It takes the attitude of, how can we be the very best, the most versatile, the most durable, the highest quality, the best engineered. And that's what I look for from Fuji. And I hope that we'll continue to see that going forward. All right, guys, we'll talk soon. Let me know what you think.